Welcome back, everyone. This is episode 8 of Layer by Layer. This week, we're going to be going over quite a doozy of an image. This is going to introduce to you guys in pretty deep detail how to perspective blend and focus stack, specifically focusing on this composition that you see in front of you. It's a wildflower bloom in front of Mount St. Helens. So first, to introduce the concepts of perspective blending and focus stacking and why they're needed and what kind of situations they're needed in, I'll pull up a janky little graphic that I drew for you guys here. So this is representing you showing up at a wildflower bloom with a mountain in the background, right? This is like, it's a very iconic landscape photography kind of shot. In a scenario where the flowers are really small, think, maybe 4 or 5 inches tall at the most, you have two options in a field, right? One is to get your camera real close to the flowers and low to the ground. This is going to make the flowers really fill up the frame. The drawback of this, though, is that the flowers are going to clip through the mountain or whatever you have in your background, really. And you're not going to get any midground in your shot because your camera is so low to the ground. So another thing you can do is you can raise the camera up a little higher, right? And so in this case, you'll capture some more of the midground, but your flowers are going to be squished into the bottom of your frame and they're going to be a lot smaller. And finally, if you raise your camera up really high, well, now you're just missing the flowers in your foreground altogether and you're just getting the midground and the mountain. So how do we reconcile these differences in perspective, right? And the answer is to shoot your foreground with the camera really close to the flowers at first, then change the perspective by raising that camera up a little bit so you can capture more of the midground and background. And then sometimes you'll find it necessary to raise your camera up another step to capture the background. When it's all said and done, you're going to take these 2 or 3 frames and you're going to blend them all together. So you're going to blend just the flower part of this shot into the midground and potentially the background of this shot. And then you might drop the background of the final shot into the final frame. And so if we hop back into Lightroom here, what that's going to do is it's going to give you a nice set of flowers in your foreground, right? So even though these flowers in real life are maybe 4 inches tall, they take up a nice amount of room in the final frame. And they really anchor this composition. Then you're going to have that midground perspective shot, which in this case is everything up to the edge of this hillside here. And then finally, a background shot. Here it's just Mount St. Helens in the background with a nice sky. One thing I want to emphasize first before going into this video is that you really don't want to have to do this unless it's absolutely necessary. If you can get the shot in one composition with maybe just a bit of focus stacking, that's always preferable than doing a really involved perspective blend. And that's just because a perspective blend is a ton of work. You're going to be staring at the frame at like 300-400% for a very, very long time. So if you can get a nice image without resorting to this technique, then go for it. However, sometimes you come across some really nice flowers that are just really, really tiny, and you just have no option but to perspective blend the frame together. So now that we have a little bit of introduction into the technique, I'll show you guys what I shot in the field to go into this final image. So first, when I showed up on scene, the sky was burning quite nice, and we had this really great low fog right in front of St. Helens. So I just shot a quick background frame real quick. This is the background frame that's going to go into the final image, just warped rather generously so the mountain protrudes above the fog a little more, and to get this foregrounds out of the way a bit. This is a pretty good demonstration of that second scenario from the doodle, if you remember this one. So in this case, the camera was high-ish, and so we have these flowers in the foreground that are smushed in the bottom of the frame. Don't really impact the frame all that much, but you have a nice amount of midground here, and of course your background is nice and sharp. So with the background frame out of the way when the conditions are really nice, then I can move on to shooting my foreground frame and midground frame. So for the foreground, I shot a focus stack of 3 images with the camera real low to the ground and really, really close to these wildflowers. In this case, the tripod center column was inverted. So this first foreground frame, I focused the camera right on this middle clump of flowers here. And even though I'm shooting at f8, you can see how quickly the focus here drops off, right? Pretty much only this foreground clump of flowers is in any kind of sharp focus. The whole midground is just blurred out entirely. Next, I moved the focus point a little bit. In this case, I actually moved it forward from the last frame. And so you see in this case here, we have these flowers here on the left that are much closer to the lens, that are more in focus in the last frame. And then these two stems here in the foreground are a lot more in focus as well. And then one last focus stack. This one has been pre-processed in Lightroom already, so it looks a little different than the other two. But I believe I put that focus point somewhere on this flower stem right here in the middle. And in this case, this was a pretty sweet spot for the focus spot, because while the foreground flowers here aren't perfectly in focus, they're in focus enough, right? It's acceptable. If you wanted to be a perfectionist about it, you could take the flower from the previous shot, these two stems here, and maybe this little clump here on the left, and focus stack it, just blend it over the out of focus areas here on this shot. But since we're already going to be doing a focus stack perspective blend on top of this, it's a lot of work. And in the end, I just didn't think it was worth the effort, especially since this was a bit of a windy day. And so these flowers aren't really going to line up properly. So this is actually one of the more important concepts when you're in the field and you're planning to do either a focus stack or a perspective blend. And that is to capture more data than you think you need. In the case of a focus stack, shoot way more frames than you think you need for the final stack, and then pick out the minimal set that you need to construct a sharp image at the end. So when you're in the field, advance that focus plane by very, very small amounts when you're focusing on things close to the camera. So in this case, you might want to focus first on something really, really close, like this little clump of foliage here, which is maybe, in this case, 4 inches away from the sensor. Then maybe you'll move the focus point back a little bit to this clump of flowers here, and that's maybe an inch back from this focus point. And you'll move it back into the clump of flowers, maybe here in like the middle of the foreground, right? And that's another like 2 inches back or so. And then finally, you'd probably set the focus point somewhere in the midground here, so you can get a sharp midground. And you might not end up needing all those frames in the end when you're making your blend. In this case, I shot 3 foreground frames and I only used 1 of them. But it's better to have that data and not use it than to not have that data and need it. Okay, so that is the focus stack for the foreground, which is actually not even a focus stack, even though I shot it with the intention of focus stacking it. Next, the camera went up a little bit and we shot a focus stack for the midground. And this is where the focus stacking really becomes pretty apparent. So this first frame here, I focused right on this foreground field of flowers. You can see the focus here drops off pretty quickly, right? This foreground clump is nice and in focus. Midground is all blurred out. Next, another focus stack, this time with the focus point somewhere probably around here on the right side. When you're shooting these frames in the field, just look for elements that are progressively farther away from the lens, not only in the center of the frame. You can use some of the elements from the sides of the frame to set your focus points when you're autofocusing. In this case here, we have a little more of the midground in focus. These foreground flower clumps are more in focus. And then finally, one focused on just the background. And this is going to form the far away midground of our final product. In the field, when you're shooting this kind of frame, even if it's just a simple focus stack, you're keeping one thing in mind. You absolutely need to get enough data frames that you can fully stack a sharp image front to back. And when you're shooting a perspective blend, this concept needs to apply for every perspective that you're moving your camera through. So in this case, even though I knew for this perspective blend that I was really only going to take the midground here from the image, or at least that's what I thought in the field, I still focus stacked for the immediate foreground, because you just never know if you're going to need that data in the final blend. Sometimes it's tempting to not shoot these close foreground stacks when you're shooting your midground and background frames, because a lot of times you just don't need them. But when you run into that one situation when you really need that, foreground clump of flowers in focus from your midground frame, and you don't have those in focus, it's going to be heartbreaking because you just can't make your image. So to recap, for this final image here, we shot focus stacks of 2 different perspectives. One, we found a really nice clump of flowers in the foreground. and stacked our way through them, 3 frames. And second, on that same clump of flowers, we just pulled the camera up a little bit and focus stack our way through the rest of the frame. In the final blend, only these red highlighted images were used. So I used this last frame from the foreground. I used the immediate foreground focus frame of the midground. And then I used the background focus frame of the midground. So in this case, I shot 3 frames that I didn't really need to in the field. But I mean, data is cheap. And if I had not shot these frames and needed one of them in the final blend, I would have been pretty pissed. So that's pretty much enough for going over the actual shots that went into the final frame. If you need more of an explanation about focus stacking, there are lots of tutorials about this available for free on YouTube. If you haven't done this before, definitely recommend looking it up, figuring out how you can do this in the field. Practice it, be comfortable with it, so that when you're in a kind of like high stress situation, when you're racing against the clock, you're not fumbling around trying to figure out how you can set your focus points. For now, we're ready to move into Photoshop. Okay, so now I'm in Photoshop and I've pulled up our initial foreground frame. And that's this nice clump of flowers here. When I'm focus stacking or perspective blending, I like to stack my images in Photoshop. I like to stack the layers from foregrounds up to the background. This is because I find it easier on the background and midground frames, to be painting out the areas that aren't in focus instead of painting in the foregrounds, basically completely blind. So let me break down for you guys how this thing was put together. So we know that we want to cut out this foreground clump of flowers here for the final perspective blend. So in this case, I actually stacked the background frame of the perspective in here first. And this, I suspect, was because I actually originally only planned on using these 2 frames for the perspective stack. So I'll disable this mask real quick here and pull this up. So this is lined up so that we get a nice amount of this midground hillside in between the flowers in the foreground. So I'll lower the opacity for you guys here a little bit. You can see how I kind of chose to line this up, right? In this case, it kind of worked out that I more or less just lined up the hillsides here. And what I was really looking for was to put this hillside line here, not quite bisecting these flower stems in the foreground, but kind of like 2/3 of the way up. Once I placed this midground frame in a position that I was pretty happy with, went ahead and put a black mask on it. And so I hid it completely. And then with broad strokes, I first started by just painting in the midground and all of these obviously out of focus areas in the foreground. And so that would be areas like back here, for example. Toggle that on and off for you guys. And of course, back here in the mountains. You can see the blend mask here at the flowers here intersecting a mountain, and above the hillside is really, really, really sloppy. And the reason for that is because I know that I'm going to clobber all of this from the midground hillside up with the background frame that we shot earlier in the morning. So there's not really any point in me being really precise around the edges of these flowers here with this perspective blended midground mask, since we're going to have to do the exact same thing with the backgrounds image. And that's going to be layered on top of this. So the sloppy mask here doesn't really matter. But we did have to be pretty precise around the flowers here. So I can break this mask down just going edge to edge on the frame a little bit. So in this case, let me first turn on just the mask itself. Right, so if you can imagine, this mask started off as basically all black. And I just, with an enormous brush, first painted in all of this stuff, right? The stuff that is obviously out of focus in the foreground frame. Then what you're going to do is you're going to zoom way in. And let's say, in this case, we did not paint in, say, this part yet. Right, so here you're going to see the foreground frame is super out of focus. So you're going to take your brush, switch it to white. Remember, this mask started off as black. And you're just going to paint over all these areas that are obviously out of focus in the foreground, right? And you're going to work around the areas that are clearly in focus. This is going to be very, very time consuming. Just a word of caution. You're going to want to really zoom in. Sometimes when you pull up this pixel grid, it's not as helpful. When you want to be really zoomed in and make it as perfect as possible. Now, getting it 100% perfect is not, is not possible every single time, but you want to get it. You want to get these edges, for example, around the foliage, like as good as you possibly can get them. And while there are certain tricks you can use, for example, in Photoshop, there's the select focus area. I personally find that those automated tools just don't really work that well. And so for me, every time I shoot a perspective blended wildflower shot, I'm always just blending these perspective blends and focus stacks in by hand. It's extremely time consuming, yes, but the initial blend really shouldn't take you, more than like 30-45 minutes per frame, right? Dependent on the resolution of your sensor, of course, but it should be like pretty clear to you from your foreground frame, like what you need to paint in and what you need to leave. So it's not difficult per se, it just requires a little bit of patience with your tablet. Okay, so from here, we've painted in a pretty effective mask for our midground perspective blend here, right? One thing I do want to point out here is like this little sloppy bit here. In areas where it's like really dark, or in areas where you have a lot of high frequency textures, you don't have to be like super pixel precise with the blending. And so in this area in particular here, you can see I just kind of freehand blended some of this foliage into itself, and you have this like leaf that kind of like disappears halfway through. But because the area of this image is so dark and because the textures here are very high frequency, it's not really something that anyone is going to notice at first glance, for sure. And even if they're looking kind of closely at your image to try to pick apart the blend lines, it's not guaranteed that they'll find this either, especially if you adjust your contrast and maybe burn this area at the bottom a little bit, right? You can kind of hide it all in the shadows. So the point here is basically to pick your battles, right? You want to be pretty precise in the areas where you're going to be drawing your viewers' attention. And so in this case, it's going to be, around these flower bulbs, the center stems of these flowers, right? Because you got these nice flowers here in the midground as well. But in the like really dark areas at the edge of the frame with high frequency textures, you don't have to be such a stickler about getting things pixel perfect. And in reality, in a shooting situation in field, unless you have the perfect, calm, clear day, these flowers are going to be moving between shots, right? So there's always going to be a little bit of like a blurry boundary on certain flower stems, for example. Don't stress too much over these blurry boundaries. They're pretty hard to notice unless the image is printed huge. And I mean, if the image is being printed like absolutely enormous, chances are your viewers are going to be standing pretty far away from it anyways. So don't drive yourself insane trying to get the absolute pixel perfect blends that you can. Just make sure that the areas that matter are good enough to withstand some scrutiny, and you can kind of fake the rest. So this image here is actually, it could be ready for the background drop right now as it is, right? And so I could turn on this background mask here and just bring in that mountain that we warped, pretty generously. And it's like, it's not bad, right? There's some small issues here. This flower here in the foreground is really out of focus. And because it's so close to the foregrounds of the scene, it's kind of distracting, right? And if we zoom in a little bit here, you can see, so this whole section of the frame, this left side here, was taken from the midground frame, right? And this, let me turn this layer off. This flower here as well is pretty out of focus. And the proximity to the front of the frame and how blurry they are is a little distracting. So in this case, we were lucky enough to shoot 3 focus stacked frames for our perspective midground. So we'll bring in that foreground frame here and just blend in this flower here. And then blend in this flower here, which is still out of focus, just a little less out of focus, right? If this was like, dead center in the middle of the frame as the main subject, this is definitely not acceptably sharp. But in this case, it's at the bottom of the frame, kind of in the shadows. It's okay for now, right? So this is a good example of what I mean by taking more data in the field than you think you'll need, right? In this case, I was pretty sure in the field that I would have everything I need for this blend, just shooting 3 focus stack frames for the foreground, and then just a single frame for the midground and the background combined. But I still focus stack that midground perspective, and it ended up really saving my hide in the end because of this little flower here. And the whole reason that I ended up needing this part of the midground frame in the first place is because in this foreground frame, when I pulled this up into Photoshop, I decided that I actually really didn't like these purple flowers here on the left. They were kind of crammed in to the side of the frame, and I didn't really want to keep them, right? I really just wanted to keep like these nice Indian paintbrushes. Without a focus stack frame for that midground perspective, where I had the foreground flowers more in focus, I would have been forced to use this, basically, right? And I don't think the image would have been quite as strong as a result. So in this case, we got rid of those really distracting blue flowers on the left, replaced them with some smaller flowers from that midground blend. And now the focus of the frame is more central, right, on this really nice clump of Indian paintbrushes. And finally, I already showed you guys what this frame looks like with this background frame in. This, again, is a black mask, completely black mask first, and then big, broad white brush to paint in the obvious areas here, and then just zooming in really far and working really carefully around the boundaries of these flowers here that stick up above the midground. And then one last touch, just a little cloning to get rid of like this distracting stuff here poking out of the middle of the hillside. Right, so at the end of the final blends, what we have is this really nice anchoring foreground element of the clump of Indian paintbrushes that I liked in the field. When I shot this foreground frame, right, I wasn't really thinking about how the midground or background were going to line up. My only focus here was to find a really nice, healthy clump of flowers and shoot just those. Then we have enough context here in the midground to show us where we are, right? That we're on a hillside that's just absolutely exploding with wildflowers. And we've also brought in some elements of that midground here on the left so that we're not so distracted by these flowers here that are close to both close to the lens and close to the edge of the frame. So from here, it's just the same old workflow that you've seen for the last 7 episodes. I actually won't even really bother going in depth into all these layers. We're going to do contrast with curves, some hue saturation layers to adjust the colors, dodge and burn, of course. And you'll notice in this case, I really burned the bottom of the frame here where we kind of faked the blend, right? And just having all this stuff really hidden in shadow just helps like prevent the out of focus areas and the weird blend lines from popping out to a viewer. Just a little bit of subtle light bleed in here from the side. I find that images where you're shooting away from the sun or perpendicular to the sun, they just end up a little bit stronger if you can bring in some light bleed from outside of the frame. Think one little clone layer here. I just found that blue flower here, dead center at the bottom of the frame, a little distracting. Bit of a grade, and then Orton lights. And then that's the image. So that's it for this episode. This time I really wanted to focus mainly on explaining to you guys how a perspective blend is done. In this case, we didn't really focus stack all that much. That's just because of like how the subject in the blend works out. I think the next frame that I'll decompose for you guys will be just a focus stack without the perspective blend. And to wrap up, I just want to summarize some of the key takeaways here for a perspective blended and possibly focus stacked shot. So number one is always take more data than you think you'll need. For every single perspective shift, you should be fully focus stacking that frame from all the way in the front of the camera to all the way in the background. Two, this is, I didn't really cover this earlier, but you want to make your perspective shifts as small as possible, right? So you don't want to have your camera 2 inches away from the ground shooting a foreground and then raise it like 3 feet in the sky to shoot your midground and background. Compositing those two frames together is going to be a really jarring perspective shift. It's not going to necessarily look fake. It's just going to look really weird to a viewer because it's almost like off-putting, right? That like you have something in the foreground, it looks like your face is right to the ground, and then the rest of the image, it looks like you're standing like 10 feet tall, right? You want to raise your camera by just a little bit every time. And so in this case, I started off with the camera maybe 4 or 5 inches off the ground. Then I raised it to maybe like 1 or 2 feet off the ground, tops, right? And then if I were to perspective blend in another frame, I'd probably go from there to 3 or 4 feet off the ground. And if I were to be blending 2 different frames for the midground, then I would probably have one blend line here in the middle of the midground for the shot where I'm like 2 to 3 feet off the ground. And then the rest of the midground, I'd bring in the shot where I was, 4 to 5 feet off the ground, or maybe with the tripod fully extended. And number 3 is basically just have a lot of patience when you're making these blends. There's not really an easy substitute to just like brute force with this kind of blend. With a simple focus stack, if your flowers weren't moving in the wind, you can use like an automated action in Photoshop to do it. For a perspective blend, you're pretty much just stuck with manually brushing in the areas that you need to brush in. And it's not really difficult, just requires a little bit of patience, right? So put on some music, put on a podcast or something, and just kind of grind it out. And that just about wraps up this episode. Next episode, I will show you a similar-ish composition, just something also with flowers in the foreground and a mountain in the background. But in that case, it will only be focus stacked and not perspective blended. And that'll show you guys the sort of like single frame, so to speak, workflow for a shot like this.